So, one of my favourite pastimes now, talking about the North, and indeed the Northern powerhouse. So, this comes from The Independent, and it's the North is still Westminster's unloved stepchild, and Brexit is only going to make things worse. What we've been saying since the very start of this whole thing. When we realise that a guarantee was really little more than hot air, it's not only deeply disappointing, but genuinely devastating for families, communities, and in this particular case, a large portion of the country. Politicians are shamefully fickle creatures. From the Mexican border walls to the $350 million a week for the NHS, few things are too far-fetched when it comes to the pledges of those vying to lead a state, regardless of whether their finances add up. Sometimes when communities are exposed to wildly unrealistic, or at least we can delight in some semblance of comedic value, other times though, when we realise that the guarantee was not really little more than hot air, it's not only deeply disappointing, but generally devastating for families, communities, and particular, in this case, a large portion of the country. It pains me to say this because I try to be an optimist, but the Northern powerhouse that so many politicians vow to create, support and promote, in this case, is in many cases being treated more like a slightly rusty northern cranking motor that's seen better days. To mark 5 years since then, Chancellor George Osborne introduced his lofty ambition to bring together the cities, towns and rural communities of the north of England to promote economic growth. The Institute of Public Policy Research this week released a report taking stock. The facts speak for themselves. Rather than eradicating the economic north-south divide, as Osborne purported it would, the plan has led to public spending in the north tumbling by $3.6 billion since 2009 to 10. In the southeast, the southwest, it's risen by $4.6 billion. In real terms, also over the time period, in real terms, transport spending rose by £330 per person in London, to just $149 per person in the north. Employment, meanwhile, fell by 2.8% in the region, dramatically outpacing London's 1.2% fall. The Northern weekly pay increased 2.4% higher compared to the 3.5% rise nationally. In real terms, and perhaps most strikingly, the report found that 200,000 more northern children are now living in poor households than before. A total of 800,000 children now live in poverty in the north. Osborne, back in June 2014, with a general election on the not-too-distant horizon, crooned that the north would become the south's brother-in-arms, but any fool can see that it's still Westminster's unloved stepchild. He pointed to Nissan and Hitachi as examples of massive investments in the region, but our government's Brexit plans have wreaked havoc on that. As there also states in the report, there is something deeply flawed about the fact that the North, home to some 15 million people and with an economy twice the size of Scotland's, is governed almost entirely by a group of people enclosed in privileged metropolitan bubble of Westminster. Devolution is desirable and could make a real difference. Unfortunately, though, that might prove irrelevant in the long run. We're on the cusp of a new era of British politics, one which may well bring with it the cliff-edge departure from the EU under Prime Minister by the name of Boris Johnson. While devastating for the City of London, a no-deal Brexit has the potential to drastically bulldoze any hard-earned economic progress the North has achieved to date. The analysis of the People's Vote campaign concludes that the region's economy would contract by up to $39.6 billion in the case of a no-deal Brexit. That's almost 4 times the size of the economic gains it's made over the last 5 years. It equates a hit of worth nearly £2,900 per person. It also points out that the government would have to replace funding for the 400 million Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund, which receives almost half of its backing from the EU and the European Investment Bank. So long, good intentions. What makes for truly shocking reading is the dossier a dossier of practical benefits compiled by the campaign, which it says would be at risk if the UK were to crash out of the bloc sans agreement. Highlights include over 570 investment projects from other EU countries, which create or project over 39,000 jobs. And that's a 300 million for academic research and universities, over 600,000 local students who were given the opportunity to study abroad. Many of us living in the capital are guilty of having a blinkered view of the UK for failing to consider parts of the country, whether north or south, which we don't and never did call home, especially as journalists. We should endeavour to change that. It's ignorant and insulting. If it's our next Prime Minister who doesn't prioritise policy that's in the best interest for our country in its entirety, and surely it's in the basic job description of any respectable head of state, then that individual is clearly not fit for office. Much as I wish it, I didn't believe a Northern Powerhouse will be a reality anytime soon. We can reasonably hope for Northern awareness, Northern commitment and Northern investment if we're lucky. If Northern progress and Northern change are feasible enough, but as ever, the bad news is that it all depends on Brexit. And that, as it stands, things are not going to be good anytime soon. So, yeah, as we've said from the very beginning, Brexit, a no-deal Brexit, is going to decimate the North. All the progress, as it said there in that statistic, in 5 years, a no-deal Brexit will wipe out 5 years of economic gains. You know, and the North overwhelmingly voted for Brexit, but there you go. It's unbelievable, but there you have it. And there's this thing of, journalists didn't appreciate it, but that's not entirely true. There were a number of journalists writing about the North and the problems that are there, predominantly, ironically, with the Yorkshire Post, a Yorkshire-based newspaper, and there were indeed some that did reach international level. The problem was that it became an unloved stepchild, predominantly because it's a Labour heartland, and the Tories do not care or do not want to put any infrastructure or any spending into an area that is just going to be immediately, Labour. But ironically, imagine they actually had done that, then they might actually see gains in the area and actually be able to reverse a lot of the bad sentiment. Now, yeah, it may take a couple of decades, but it is fully feasible that if they did do that, maybe in 3 or 4 decades' time, you could see a Conservative win Barnsley. That sounds like a pipe dream, but imagine if the Conservatives did actually support the North economically and really get it working again, properly, with proper infrastructure, investment, you name it. Potentially it could happen. Now, a lot of it, as again was brought up in the article, we have this massive fund for it, which, once we leave the EU, half of it is gone. In fact, more than half of it. How are they going to replace it? How are they going to replace all that money for investment for the rest of the country? But, we've been over that many, many times. They just can't. There just isn't enough money. So you have Boris Johnson going around saying, I'll cut taxes for the wealthy. That's not going to help much when you've got less money in the budget to try and spend. But there you go.